I have a question about your 188-day. Not so much about the movie, because I haven't seen the movie. I've seen both trailers, and I have a general idea where it's going. But when I walked away from it today, and I actually went to USGS because I hadn't done it before, Lucas, and I went back and I tracked a bunch of 7.0 earthquakes and higher, and I went back to 2/1809, 7.0 in the Kermatic region, and it appears that earthquakes are occurring for this segment, as you say. You have 100. I came 188, 187, 189. You're right. What does this mean to you?
Basically, what I figured out is that the earthquakes, every time Earth lines up with the object and the sun is when we have one of these earthquakes. And when we're in the springtime part of the orbit, we have the pole shifting or the axis shifting earthquakes. And basically, the reason why it's 188 days rather than 182.5 days, which is exactly half a year, is because the object is not coming directly at the center of the sun. If the object was at a 90-degree angle and coming directly at the center of the sun, Earth would line up with it every 182.5 days. But the object's in elliptical orbit with the sun. So, by the time we reach that place in the orbit 6 months later, that object has already moved thousands of miles upward, so you have to add a couple extra days to the orbit. And it makes perfect sense. And so, it looks as if there's something out there. And you had mentioned Comet Elenin before. Back from the beginning of when this whole Comet Elenin thing happened, I didn't say much about it. I kept my mouth shut because I didn't know. I don't have, access to NASA telescopes and sophisticated equipment like that. So what I suspect, my theory is that the comet was actually in orbit with the dense object in space, and that when it got close enough to the sun, the gravitational pull between the two, the sun and the dense object is what tore the comet to shreds. So that's what I believe happened with Comet Elenin.
So you think it's an interaction between three objects, the sun, the heavy mass object, and Elenin. The interaction between the sun, our sun, and the heavy mass object basically crumbled the comet.
Yeah, it's just a regular comet. It's just not in orbit. The comets we've dealt with up until just recently have been in orbit with our sun, like Halley's Comet, things like that. But this comet was most likely in orbit with the object coming in, whether it be a brown dwarf star or a neutron star. And we've been getting a lot of sun-diving comets lately, which are probably also comets that are in orbit with the object, and that's why they're sun-diving, because they're not in a normal orbit, so the sun's sucking them into its with its gravity. I don't know where this object is. I do know that there have been all these Earth changes, and it's been escalating and escalating every year. 2011, we've already broken so many records this year that we're going to break a record for most records broken in 1 year.
The 188 days is definitely unique because of the orbit and of the position and, quite honestly, of the severity. Because I'm not going to negate the fact that the largest earthquakes occurred on the 188-day cycle.
Yeah, and then they also had the axis shifters, which were in the springtime part of the orbit, which would tell you that most likely that object is on that side of the sun. That when we're in springtime is when we're actually in between the sun and whatever dense object is out there. From reading the ancient texts and all that, I never believed that you'd ever be able to see this object until it was right up on us, because of the fact that if it's a brown dwarf star, it doesn't put out any visible light. It only puts out infrared light. So even if the object was as close as the moon, okay, all you're going to see is a big black circle in space. It's just going to be a big black round spot that's going to block out the stars. And so I've never really concentrated so much on trying to find the object as I have concentrated on the preparations going on. That's a big part of the presentation, is the actual preparations that the governments and corporations and elites have been doing over the last 20 years. And, and the ancient stuff, their descriptions of the object.
What can you tell us about what you see as government action specifically started because of something from space?
Well, it looks like around in the late 70s, they launched the Pioneers to go look for the object. And then it seems like right after they discovered the object, there was announcements made in the newspapers and in encyclopedias and things like that. And then all of a sudden, everybody went into hush-hush mode. Propaganda started when they started changing FEMA from actual emergency management into what it is today. It seemed like that right at that time period, right about the Reagan assassination attempt, is when it all started to go chaotic.
I'm going to answer a question quickly, Lucas, from the chat room. My friend Profit Chaser, he asked me what two events were 188 days apart, and since I have them written down here, I'm just gonna run over them. We start at 9/15/11, a 7.3 earthquake in Fiji. We go back to 3/11, which is the Honshu 9.0. We go back to 9/5 and 9/3/2010, a 7.0 in New Zealand. We go back to March 1st of 2010, an 8.8 in Bio. We go back to 8/25/09, a 6.9 in Banda, and then we go back to 2/18/09, a 7.0 in the Kermadec Islands. I did the numbers, 187, 188, 189, plus or minus a day. You all have 6 earthquakes that were that far apart over 7.0. I will also add that those 6 earthquakes include the largest earthquakes of that period, the 9.0 and the 8.8 in Bio.
My research leads me to believe that approximately 11,500 years ago, it was real bad at that time because of the area the Earth was in space when this object passed by. And I'll give you a good for instance. First of all, it's when Plato dated the sinking of Atlantis. Okay, right after that, or right at that time period, we had the extinction of all the big mammals like the woolly mammoth and the woolly rhino, the giant Irish deer, the giant sloth, things like that. So they all disappeared at that time period. Also, the woolly mammoths that were frozen, the ones that died in Siberia, they were frozen. There's a popular misconception that they had grass in their mouth. That's not true. They had undigested grass in their stomach, which would tell you that they weren't like instantly frozen like in 10 seconds like you see on The Day After Tomorrow. Okay, they probably died of exposure, and then over the course of a couple hours they froze solid before the actual food in their stomach had a chance to digest. So what I've come to is that approximately, before 11,500 years ago, there was an advanced civilization on this planet. They knew how to fly. They knew how to make sophisticated machines. And then what happened is the Earth's axis actually tilted 2,000 miles when this object passed by. And not just a couple inches like what we saw in the last few earthquakes. Now what's interesting is the woolly mammoths, approximately 12,000 years ago, North America was about 2,000 miles closer to where the North Pole is today. That's why we had all the glaciers in North America. Siberia was much lower, closer to the equator, 2,000 miles. That's why then when this thing happened, it shifted the global axis. It thrusted Siberia up towards the pole, which thus froze the woolly mammoths, brought North America closer to the equator. Then all of our ice caps melted. And also Antarctica. At the time before the shift, half of Antarctica was most likely ice-free. And so that's probably why the Neumayer station, I don't know if your listeners or you have seen this, but the logo for the 1999 Neumayer station down in Antarctica shows the continent of Antarctica with a magnifying glass over it and 3 pyramids underneath the magnifying glass. Like they're looking for pyramids down there in Antarctica. So, it's all perfectly explained by the and the biggest thing of all, which I forgot to mention here, was the fact that all the sites, Easter Island, the Great Pyramids, the Nazca lines, all these sites are put in this perfect circle around the world. And literally, if you draw a line between all these ancient sites that all line up with the stars 12,000 years ago, they all form this perfect circle, and right in this perfect circle, in the very center of it, is right where the border of Canada and Alaska meet, right at the Pacific Ocean there, which is about 2,000 miles. So it tells us that they marked out, they purposely lined these sites up with the stars 12,000 years ago, and they put them in this perfect line, or this perfect circle, to tell us that this is when they built these sites, and they put the perfect circle there to show us where the pole was at that time.
Oh, that's where the pole was, where Alaska and Canadian
Yeah.
borders.